Romans. Yeah, the written language arrived in this country with the Romans. So everything we have before them are legends. Yeah? Now, in this legend, Bladud was the son of King Ludibris, who was the king of the Doboni tribe, a Celtic tribe that inhabited the area around what is Bath today. And according to the legend, the prince was everything in a legend should be. He was young, he was handsome, he was a good son, and a brave warrior. However, he was the son of Ludibris of the Doboni tribe. However, he caught a terrible illness, an illness that was fatal, incurable, highly infectious, with very unsightly symptoms and painful ones. An illness that today we would call leprosy. And so, like all lepers at the time, he was banished from society. He had to leave his father's court and go out and live in the wilderness. And so in order to procure himself a living, he became a swineherd. And according to the legend, one day he was out walking with his pigs when he came across these hot swamps. Now, in some countries around the world, thermal waters, hot springs are a fairly usual phenomena. Not in this country. They are the only ones in the whole country. And so that in itself was quite surprising. But also, Bladud noticed that when his pigs emerged from the water, they seemed to have been miraculously healed of blisters, sores and other ailments affecting their skin. Of course, suffering the terrible illness that he himself suffered, he also decided to bathe in the hot springs, and lo and behold, when he emerged, he seemed to have been miraculously cured of his terrible illness. And so over the moon with joy he returned to his father's court, where he was received with open arms, and shortly after he returned to the site of the hot swamps and built a temple, well, a small shrine to the Celtic goddess Sulis, who was a goddess of health, fertility and wisdom. And that is probably how the Romans found it 100 years later when they first set foot on the British Isles. Already in the 1st century BC, under the great Emperor Julius Caesar, the Romans had tried to conquer the island that they named Britannia. The rumours that had reached Rome were that this was an island full of gold and silver and inhabited by barbarian tribes. However, as would happen many times in the history of this country, the storms, the sea, the wind kept the invaders away. And it wasn't until the year 43 AD under the Emperor Claudius that the Romans began the conquest of Britain. They named the island Britannia, and they founded a trading post on the River Thames, which they called Londinium. This would grow to be one of the most important and largest cities in the world. The island is still called Britain, the city is still called London. So you see, things don't change much in this country. There is a certain reluctance to change, in case you hadn't noticed already. Now, you know, the Romans were the first great civilization in this part of the world, and they managed to conquer most of the known world to them. The empire stretched from northern Africa to northern Europe, from southwest Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, to the Rhine River in the northeastern territory. But they didn't manage to conquer all of it. And on this island, they didn't manage to conquer what today we call Scotland or parts of Wales, but they did manage to conquer England. However, it wasn't all plain sailing. First, the Romans rounded up a number of kings and chieftains and important people and took them to Rome so they could marvel at what the eternal city was like, and that way convince these leaders that they would be better off joining the Roman Empire. And many of them did join voluntarily. However, there was one great rebellion, and this was led by a woman. Her name was Boudica, or Boadicea, and she was the queen of the Iceni tribe. While her husband was still alive, there had been a treaty between him and the Romans of no aggression. When her husband died, the Romans attacked the Iceni they raped her daughters and flogged Boudica in public. And in revenge, she began a rebellion against the Romans that would turn out to be one of the biggest bloodbaths, and there have been many, in the history of this country. Thousands of peoples lost their lives. Hundreds of towns, hamlets and villages were attacked, sacked, looted and destroyed by one or either side. Eventually the Romans would manage to quash the rebellion, and so the reconstruction of Roman Britain began, and it was probably at that point when they came across the shrine to Sulis. And they decided that in the place they would build an important Roman town or villa, because any of those worth its salt would have at least two important buildings. What do you think they were? I'll tell you one, Roman baths. Now you tell me the other one. Think of gladiator, an arena, yeah, or an amphitheater. Okay, and in the case of Bath, they built the magnificent baths of Aqua Sulis, as the Romans named the town. Aqua being the Latin for water, Sulis the Celtic goddess. And so, you know, the Romans were not only very advanced, were not only a great army with advanced strategy in the military, but they were also advanced in many other ways. They brought the written language to these islands. They were advanced in politics, social classes, law. They had written law. They also were amazing constructors and engineers, architects, and that's why you'll see Roman remains all over Europe, many of them 2,000 years old, like the ones you're going to see today. And so, because public baths were important for the Romans, because it wasn't only something, you know, bathing in private for their hygiene, it was part of their social life. The wealthy and powerful Romans would go to the baths with their entourage of servants and slaves. They would go there to see and be seen dressed in their finest clothing, and it was a place where people would bathe, but also where politics were discussed, conspiracies were born, business deals were made, and all the fun and frolics that the hedonistic Romans are so well known for would also take place. And so they decided to build these magnificent baths that were beautiful in their elegance and their simplicity. And first of all, they decided to tame the springs, and to do that they built a reservoir made of lead, and using that same lead they built a piping system that would take the water down to the place where they decided to build the baths, and they built an underground heating system for the whole complex using the vapors of the water that still works today. Yeah? And so the town of Aqua Sulis, or the villa, became an important site of pilgrimage. In the baths, there were 3 baths that you will be able to see today: the Great Bath, the King's Bath and the Circular Bath. You will be walking on the same paving stones that the Romans did 2,000 years ago. Do not imagine you're going to see a few columns and some stones lying on the floor. You're going to see one of the best Roman sites in the whole of northern Britain. The Roman Empire lasted for about 4 centuries. Yeah, it's towards the end of the 4th century, as part of the natural cycle of life of a civilization. It is born, it is developed, it reaches its maximum point, and then enters into kind of decline and eventual replacement, yeah, or disappearance. And so it's towards the end of the 4th century where the final Roman legions leave Britain to go and defend Rome. Now, when we speak of 4 centuries of Roman Britain, do not imagine that for 4 centuries they are continuously invading hordes of Romans. They invade, they divide, they conquer, and eventually the local people adopt the Roman way of life, their language, their habits, their religion, and the way of life in general. Yeah, and also when we speak about, you know, the Roman civilization, do not imagine it's this great benevolent civilization. It's not. They capture the local population, they use them as slaves, and thousands of people probably died here mining for gold and silver. The local population would have been made slave, and they would have died in the mines. Yeah? But in any case, you know, they were far more advanced than most of their contemporaries, who were still, you know, couldn't read or write, or, you know, were even more barbaric than the Romans themselves. But in any case, you know, Aqua Sulis becomes an important site of pilgrimage. People come from all over Britain and possibly Europe to the healing waters of the complex. And they not only build the baths, but they also build a temple dedicated to the goddess Sulis, Celtic, Minerva, the Roman goddess that shared similar qualities. Yeah? And the town flourishes to become one of the most important towns in Roman Britain. By the end of the 4th century, the Romans leave, and this country is plunged into an era that many historians have named the Dark Ages, because it's the eclipse of one great civilization that is not replaced by another, but rather by a semi-permanent state of war because of all the invasions that this island is suffering. From the west, we have Germanic tribes like the Angles and the Saxons that would later populate the country. Centuries later would come the Danes and the Vikings. From the north, attacks from the Scots. From the west, the Irish raid. And so the country is plunged into this kind of semi-permanent state of war. It becomes dangerous to travel, and so Aqua Sulis loses importance as a place of pilgrimage, and eventually the Roman baths also enter into decline. It's in one of the annual floodings of the River Avon that still floods every year, this year was no less, that the Roman baths become buried under meters of mud, silt and water for almost 1,400 years. And that is the reason why they are so well preserved, because for all that time they were protected from humans and from the elements. Yeah? And so it's not until the year 1770 when, quite by chance, some workmen are digging up the main road in the town of Bath to build a sewage system, when they come across the bronze gilded head of the statue of the goddess of Sulis, Minerva. With this important discovery, the excavations to find what had been until then the legendary Roman baths begin, and eventually they are discovered, and the whole discovery kind of coincides with the second golden age of Bath, because it's due to the discovery of the baths, a number of royal visits, first Queen Anne, then Queen Mary, then Queen Victoria being a princess, and also due to the advent of a new type of tourism in the 18th century, medical tourism, that Bath lives its second golden age. If you think back to the England of the 18th century, think of Jack the Ripper, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Sweeney Todd. Yeah, that's 18th century, 19th century England, the Victorian era. If you think about that, you can imagine that, you know, hygiene was not top of people's lists of things to do, yeah? And also, who could afford to go to the doctor? Only affluent people could afford to pay for a doctor, yeah? Medicine was nowhere near as developed as it is today, and so, you know, doctors started to send in their wealthy patients to places on the coast, places with hot springs, spas, thermal waters, because we can imagine that a lot of people's ailments were mainly due to a fundamental lack of hygiene. And so this English high society starts flocking to the town of Bath, and it becomes the favourite recreational place for English high society, and thus it is redeveloped in the beautiful style of architecture that you'll see today. This is called Georgian or Regency architecture. It's a British type of neoclassical, if you like. And you'll see it when we get to the baths. You'll see that outside they have the columns, they have the pediments imitating Roman architecture, and when we go inside the reception, the foyer, if you look up at the ceiling, you'll see a beautiful dome with frescoes on it. And then once you go into the baths themselves, you will walk 3 or 4 meters down, because the Roman baths are 3 or 4 meters below the current street level. That's how much the street level has gone up over these millennia. Yep. So I'm going to make these same commentaries in Spanish, and then when we're in Bath, I'll say a few more things as we're driving around, okay?